Kyle, why don't you go ahead and let people in? Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to have a few more people trickling in, so give us a few more minutes and we'll be starting shortly. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us for our Midwest Regional Rail Planning Study Stakeholder Workshop. We're excited to have you all today and appreciate you joining us. As we get started, I just kind of want to do a few kind of introductions on our technology overview. Today's workshop, which is the part one of a two-part session, is going to primarily be a presentation format. And so as such, we're asking that people stay muted with their cameras off unless you are speaking. Additionally, for your information, this meeting is being recorded, so I want you to know that. Likewise, interested parties, so people that are not members of the stakeholder planning group, are able to watch the workshop right now through YouTube Live. So it is being live streamed. There will be pause points during the presentation in which people will be able to take some time to answer questions. If you do have questions as we go through the presentation, please feel free to enter them into the chat function. Otherwise, when we do get to those pause point slides, we'll address them at that time. And so we'll have kind of a midway pause point for question answering, and then we'll have a larger discussion and question answering time at the end. So again, thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate you keeping on mute and your video off, and we look forward to chatting with you at the end. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Chrissy. This is Peter Schwartz, the Federal Railroad Administration. I'm the project manager for the Midwest Regional Rail Planning Study. And I want to start off just by welcoming everyone to this, our first virtual session for phase 2 of the study, our first formal meeting of the stakeholder planning group. I think we're going to forego kind of going around the virtual room, so to speak, for everyone to introduce themselves. We have about 50 folks on the line right now, but if you're interested in who's here with you, you can open up the participant tab in Zoom, and it seems like everyone's pretty clearly identified, so you'll be able to get an idea of exactly who's on with us. I want to start off by just saying, thank you to all of you for your patience as we have kind of felt our way through how we're going to proceed with the study. Patience both in terms of being willing to participate in the second phase of the study, and also obviously your patience as we've been figuring out exactly how to move forward with things in light of all the impacts of COVID-19. We did hope that we'd have a chance to all reconvene in person. Obviously that wasn't possible, and we ended up doing what many of you suggested from the get-go, which was to adopt a virtual approach to the stakeholder planning group meetings. But we're going to do our best to make this as interactive as possible, particularly for the second session that we have scheduled for next week. As Chrissy said earlier, this session is going to be a bit heavier on the presentation side. For those of you who participated in the stakeholder planning group meetings during phase 1, you all probably remember that generally those all-day meetings were kind of heavier on the presentation side in the morning, with a lot more discussion, breakout rooms, interaction during the afternoon. And we're taking a very similar approach here, but splitting it up over 2 days just to try to avoid the fatigue that inevitably sets in when you're sitting in on a meeting online for too long. Obviously this is not quite as nice of a venue as we had during phase 1, where we were in St. Paul Union Depot, or SEMCOG's offices in Detroit, or the Willis Tower with CMAP in Chicago, but we do appreciate you all joining us here on Zoom. We're going to hope that things go smoothly technologically, but again, ask your patience if we have any hiccups. I know I'm here with a couple of my junior associates, one 9 years old, the other 6. So I don't think I'm going to get any interruptions, but again, I'm probably not the only one here in that kind of situation. So appreciate your patience if anything does come up. Turning though to the agenda itself, though, just walk through things briefly. We'll start with, I'll walk us through the project team. We'll look at the phase 1 draft network, essentially recapping where we left at the end of phase 1, getting on 3 years ago now in 2017. We'll then look at why we embarked on this second phase of the study, somewhat of a recap of some of what we presented in the webinar we held back in March, just getting everyone up to speed on what the purpose of this second phase was, what prompted it, particularly in terms of updates to the Connect model that underpins all the analysis in this study. We're then going to look at how those changes to Connect affected the results of the network that we arrived at in phase 1. So essentially compare results as they were when we left things in 2017 and how they look now with the revised model. And then we're going to look at how we might revise the network that we arrived at during phase 1 in light of some of the changes and some of the differences that we're seeing when we look at that network using the revised model. What kind of approaches we might take towards optimizing the network, what kind of objectives we might set for the performance of the network in light of some of the changes that we're seeing resulting from the revisions to the model, and what kind of metrics we'll look at and kind of seeing how those optimization strategies play out. We're then going to walk through some alternative networks that we've developed already. Alexis Howland will walk us through those as the technical lead with the consultant team on the project. We essentially took a first crack at doing a whole bunch of new runs using the Connect model, trying to develop and kind of tweak networks that look at various optimization strategies, various priorities for the performance of the network. We're going to walk through a few of them. We did far more than we have time to look at today, but we're looking at essentially a sample that covers a broad range of optimization strategies and covers those runs that seem to have the most promise going forward. Then we'll turn to look at the next steps, and in particular, what will be coming up when we reconvene next Tuesday. You can go to the next slide. So here's just a quick look at the project team. We have been extremely lucky to be able to keep the band together, so to speak, after a pause of almost 2 years, and then obviously some additional delays even after we brought everyone back for phase 2 that was associated with everything going on with COVID. So as I mentioned, I'm Peter Schwartz from FRA. I'm the project lead here at FRA. Anna Lynn Smith from HDR, formerly of WSP. She made a move in the last year, but has stayed with the team, is the project manager on the consultant side. Then we're joined on the stakeholder engagement front by Chrissy Bright, who is with Metro Strategies. She's a new face to the team, although the firm Metro Strategies was with us on phase 1. And she's joined by Mark Barrett with Quetica, again, a familiar face from phase 1. On the kind of technical analysis front, we have Alexis Howland, who you'll be hearing from today as our technical lead, and Brandon Williams, both from WSP. We have a senior strategic advisor, Yoav Hagler with DV Engineering and Consulting. Again, he too has been with the team the whole time, although he's changed seats a couple times from one firm to another, and then a firm changing names, but the same Yoav who's been with us from the beginning. And lastly, Anna Lynn is pulling double duty, not just as the project manager, but also leading the development of all the documentation for this, and specifically the draft and then final regional rail plan report that we'll eventually be distributing to everyone and will serve as the memorialization of all the work that we've done here. So we can go to the next slide. Today, we're going to be hearing from three of us, obviously myself. Anna Lynn will talk to us about essentially recapping what we looked at during phase one, and also work through some of the question and answer periods that we'll have. And the real main event here will be led by Alexis Howland, who, as I mentioned, was the consultant team technical lead, walking us through the actual model runs that we've performed, looking at different options for the network. So we can go to the next slide, and I will turn it over to Anna Lynn to walk us through phase one.
All righty. Thanks, Peter. Good morning, everyone. Anna Lynn Smith, glad to be here today in this venue, and glad to have such a large number of participants, folks interested in our efforts here as we continue to move forward. So just a brief recap in terms of where we left off at the end of phase one, and we had a little preview of that back in March, but I know there's some new folks since March, and just wanted to start off with a quick overview. This first slide here is draft network review in terms of the service tiers, and this is what FRA has established for its vision for high-speed rail, and these tiers have been applied to other corridors throughout the U.S. But there's kind of 3+1 layers here. We have core express corridors with the highest speeds over 125 miles an hour, kind of coming down to regional corridors between 90 and 125 miles an hour, emerging and feeder corridors up to 90. And then we also have what has been termed as network independent corridors. And for each of these service tiers, there's common characteristics, the markets served, and on-time performance measures that have been established. So you may recall from our network from phase one, we have each of the networks categorized according to one of those service tiers. So for that last category, in terms of the categorization, we have identified certain networks, corridors that were integral to the network. And these are the ones that influence the ridership on other corridors. And any sort of decisions related to service tier or service frequency need to be made or should be made in coordination with other network decisions. And you'll see that these are the ones that show up on our map, if you're familiar with our map, which we'll be showing. But then we also have these last three, either network independent, future corridor, and small market. And you may recall from phase one, these were shown as the dashed lines on our map. And so what they mean is that they may be important to local markets. They may have existing passenger rail service on them, but for the purposes of our analysis using Connect, we did not consider them in that they did not add significantly to the ridership numbers. These decisions can be made independent of other network corridors and the modeling in Connect. And they could be added in future years. I know that some of these are currently being studied for passenger rail. Some do have intercity passenger rail service on them now. And so they're still important. We want to show them. But in terms of using the model for Connect, they are not included. So on the next slide, we show the network as we ended up at phase one. But just really, there's a couple quick changes that we made to this, kind of minor adjustments to those network independent small market future corridors, including adjusting where Quincy shows up on the map, including a marker for Quad Cities. We added a marker dash line for Port Huron. And we've also added a connection as a network independent between Columbus and Pittsburgh. So this is where we landed for phase one. And then on the next slide, this shows where we are and where we ended up in terms of our phase one Connect base network. So these are the corridors that we used, including the service tiers that were identified and where we left off for our phase one efforts for Connect. So from here, I'll pivot over to Peter, who's going to continue on with the phase two efforts.
Yeah, and if we could just go back one slide there, just to clarify kind of what the difference was between the last two slides we looked at. this is the network that we actually modeled in Connect at the end of phase 1. There are limitations within Connect, some of which we've actually addressed between phase 1 and phase 2 with some of the enhancements to the model that we've been pursuing, but there are limitations on the number of corridors that you can look at simultaneously. So again, as Annalyn said, for those corridors where our earlier analysis showed that they weren't as integral to the overall performance of the network as a whole, we did not include those in the final Connect analysis as part of phase 1, but only looked at these corridors that you're seeing on your screen right now. So we can go on to the next slide here. We'll turn now to how we got to phase 2 here from phase 1, because certainly when we last got together in Chicago in the winter of 2017, early winter 2017, it seemed like we had this in the can and we're ready to move straight forward to a final report. But as we started digging through things a bit more closely, really coming out of the analysis that we did as part of phase 1, we found that there seemed to be some anomalies in the trip database, particularly the auto trip tables that serve as one of the major elements of the foundation for the demand forecast. And the demand forecasts are a huge part of the overall functioning of the Connect model, and the output from the demand forecast is a major part of what we took into account in making some of the decisions that we arrived at during phase 1. In particular, we saw that the out-year forecasts sometimes seem to be far greater than underlying demographic forecasts could really justify. And in fact, in the phase 1 model and in the auto trip table that was used in that, we had applied artificial growth caps to the out-year forecast for auto trips as a way of dealing with that. But even then, the forecasts were extremely high. We also found that some of the things we tried to do to be kind of clever in establishing the base year 2015 auto trip volumes between CDSA pairs, like trying to draw in big data sources from cell phone data and other location-based data where it was available, introduced an inconsistency where some CDSA pairs we were able to bring in that data, but if you looked at a CDSA pair where we didn't have that kind of big data available and we were synthesizing things based on really direct demand models, kind of gravity models for those of you who groove on demand forecasting stuff, we found that even for CDSA pairs with very similar demographic characteristics, we saw pretty divergent estimates of auto trips from one CDSA to another. So in this revised auto trip table, we decided to adopt the KISS principle and just synthesize data using a direct demand model across the board. Now that model, of course, was actually developed using real data, but it eliminated one area of inconsistency that seemed to have the potential to skew some of the results. Now the bar chart we've got here shows what the effect of these changes to the auto trip table were for the entire Connect model. So this covers all of the CDSA pairs within Connect, which covers the entire country, parts of Canada and Mexico. It suppresses CDSA pairs that are closer than 50 miles apart, or those that I believe are further than 700 miles apart, because it's trying to hit the sweet spot of where intercity passenger rail can be truly competitive, or is most competitive at least. And you can see that the auto trip table for phase 2 actually had somewhat higher total auto trip volumes nationwide for 2015, the green bar there, but significantly lower auto trips in 2055. And as the 2055 forecasts that really matter, because that was our horizon year for the study. And really all of our analysis was based on forecasts for that 2055 year. The idea being that this is a long range study looking at the kind of strategic development of a regional network of intercity passenger rail corridors. And we don't want to be making decisions based on what things were like in this case in 2055, or even what things might look like in 2035. But these would be very long-lived assets that would be built to develop these corridors. So we look at a horizon year quite far out down the line at 2055. And it really was the auto trip table that was the primary, the changes to the auto trip table that was the primary impetus for embarking on the second phase of the study. There were some additional enhancements and changes that we made to connect. One of them I mentioned earlier. There was a limitation on the number of corridors that we could model simultaneously. We bumped that up as part of some enhancements to the model that we were pursuing independently. We looked at some small changes in the operating and maintenance cost, unit costs that were used as the basis of the O&M cost estimates. But had it only been those kind of secondary model enhancements, we never would have embarked on the second phase. Those really were kind of on the margins. They were looking more at the long term, but the auto trip table revisions were the big issue here. We can go on to the next slide here. So, having decided that these changes in the auto trip table were significant enough to warrant a second look at some of the conclusions that we reached in phase one, we embarked on the second phase with a few different objectives. Now, the first was to see how the revised estimates for auto trips affected our perception of kind of baseline conditions and the assessment of the major travel markets within the region. For those of you who were at the first stakeholder planning group meeting in Chicago back in 2017, this was something we looked at in quite a bit of detail, and we wanted to see how the revised trip table affected some of the conclusions or insights that we gained as part of that analysis. This was information that the second look we presented back at the March 17th webinar. We've looked at a little bit just now. We'll look at a little bit of that later, but we want to kind of look at some of these other elements of phase two. So the second bullet here, something we will be looking at that's new today, which is essentially seeing how the new model and specifically the new database affected the previously proposed regional network, the phase one network that Annalyn showed us just a few slides ago, essentially keeping everything constant except really the auto trip table, and see how that actually affected the basic performance of the network that we arrived at earlier. And then lastly, phase two is looking to determine what, if any, changes we should make to the network that we arrived at as part of phase one based on the revised estimates of 2055 auto trips that come with the new trip table. At the beginning, we did include that qualifier, what, if any, changes. As we'll see, the changes were significant enough that it's fairly clear that some pivots, some revisions or refinements are likely in order, but there are a lot of different directions we could end up going with that. So we can go to the next slide. As I mentioned, while this is the first formal meeting of the stakeholder planning group for phase two, we did hold two earlier webinars, one on March 17th, another on April 21st, where we looked at some of the scope of phase two, some of the kind of earlier preparatory work. As I mentioned, on March 17th, we looked at the baseline conditions, how those were affected by the new auto trip tables, and similarly, how the major market assessment was affected by those. And on April 21st, we had a State of the States webinar, essentially providing an opportunity for the lead stakeholders to the study, that is the state departments of transportation and the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission, to give an update on what has changed with their own endeavors on intercity passenger rail development over the last few years. We can go to the next slide. So we'll pivot now to look at some of a little bit of a recap from what we looked at back in March, but also some new information on how things actually play out when we apply this new auto trip table to the network that we arrived at phase 1. And here we're looking at the same diagram that Annalyn showed us earlier, but in the table, we have the results coming out of Connect, phase 1 column reflecting the auto trip table that we use in phase 1, and phase 2 reflecting the auto trip table that that has been revised and is being used as the basis for phase 2. And again, we're looking at 2055, our horizon year is the basis of all the analysis, and that is where the changes are greatest based on the reduction in auto trip volumes in 2055 between the old trip table and the new one. The only thing that changed here is the auto trip table. None of the other revisions, enhancements that we made to Connect were applied here. So you'll see, for instance, that the operating maintenance cost estimate is identical and the capital costs are identical. But where we are seeing big changes are the basic demand metrics of ridership, passenger miles, and revenue, and consequently significant reduction in the operating cost recovery ratio. An important thing to see here, though, is that the ridership reduction associated with the revision in the auto trip table was 41%, whereas the passenger mile and revenue reduction was 26% and 27%, respectively, essentially tracking one another given the correlation between passenger miles and revenues, given that fares generally are a function of distance, at least in part a function of distance. What this really reflects is the fact that in the revised auto trip table, the 2055 estimates for auto trips went down pretty dramatically for CBSA pairs, origin destination pairs, that were relatively close to one another, meaning that the trips themselves between those would generate relatively small numbers of passenger miles, relatively low revenue. The longer distance CBSA pairs showed much less reduction in the new auto trip table. And in some cases, actually, I think for a few, there actually were increases in the new auto trip table for particularly some of the very longest CBSA pairs. And really this speaks to the fact that the earlier trip table that we had seemed to show essentially, particularly for the out years, a pretty systematic bias for overcooking the growth for those short distance CBSA pairs. So again, what we saw here is a very significant decrease in ridership, a significant but less extreme decrease in passenger miles and revenue, and kind of pivoting off of the reduction in revenue, reduction in the operating cost recovery ratio. You can go to the next page here. So here you can see this looks at the total ridership for 2055 for each of the corridors that were used within the Connect analysis that we just looked at. And you'll see that some of these actually have things strung together because we did keep to the 15 corridor limit that the old version of Connect used, so that we can make sure that we were controlling for essentially everything except the change in the auto trip table. Tried to keep everything else methodologically consistent. And what you can see here is, and it's a little bit difficult to suss out just looking at it briefly, but there were reductions more or less across the board for all corridors in forecasted 2055 ridership. But by and large, we found that the reductions were greater for the corridors that had CBS, that were shorter, and thus had CBSA pairs that were generally closer together. If we go to the next slide, you can see again, I think we made on looking at revenue forecast for 2055 between phase 1 and phase 2, that proportionally speaking, the decreases were less for the longer corridors. So, one of the longest corridors and one of the highest volume corridors that we had within the phase 1 network was Chicago Twin Cities. And while there was a, not minor reduction in forecasted revenue from somewhere around 675 million to about 525 million, proportionally it's less than some of the other shorter distance corridors that we looked at, for instance, Cincinnati to Cleveland, which saw more than a 50% decrease in forecasted revenue between using the old trip table and using the new one. So we can go to the next slide, just kind of recapping here that the new auto trip table with lower 2055 forecasted auto volumes affected rail ridership and network performance really across the board. We saw the lower ridership and revenue across all corridors, across all service tiers. It's pretty, in terms of the direction things went, it was fairly consistent. But that said, as I mentioned, revenue and passenger miles decreased less than ridership. And that really is reflecting the fact that the database affected the shorter trips more than the longer ones. So we can go to the next slide here. And for this first Q&A session, we're going to rely on folks who have been typing in questions for the chat, but we will have an opportunity at the end to just open things up and everyone can ask questions. We can have a bit of discussion as well, but I'm gonna ask Kyle from Metro Strategies to read out anything that we might have here so far.
Hi, Peter. So we have not received any questions from participants thus far. So if we want to give it here 30 seconds, see if anybody has any questions, or we want to proceed to the next slide.
Yeah. I think we may have gotten a couple that I think we were able to address kind of on the fly as I was talking. But again, if anyone's got questions, please type them in now. But if you're comfortable for now, we can certainly move on. We'll have another chance at the end of the session.
This is Dave Berger in Lima. I noticed that the Chicago to Columbus route actually held its ridership and also increased its revenue, contrary to the overall trend. Is that correct?
That is correct. And, it was a bit of an outlier there. It's hard to exactly pin what the cause for that was, but again, by some of these things were due to some of the changes were due to the kind of overcooked out year forecasts that were in the earlier trip table. Some of them were due to shifts from using a mix of location-based data as the basis for some of these auto trip estimates to using a fully direct demand model based approach for those estimates. But your observation was correct there.
Peter, Kevin Brubaker here. I texted you directly rather than the moderator my questions. The burning question I was with the ridership problems that you faced, are those indicative of similar flaws in other travel demand models? Or is this sort of a one-off problem?
You know, I'll say this, that, and I'll say this as someone who, you know, in a previous life was a full-time travel demand forecaster for passenger rail stuff. You know, it is a fairly inexact science, and there's always the opportunity for error to be introduced in one way or the other. To be perfectly honest, this was a mistake, and it's something that FRA and I should have caught earlier on when we started seeing some of these anomalous forecasts for the out year auto trips. But what I'll say is that, and kind of the model we're trying to set for folks all over the place who are engaged in this kind of work, is that when you find that something doesn't look right, the right thing to do is to go in and try to correct it, and not shy away from the possibility of having to change your analysis and change some of your conclusions if the data seems to be pointing you in that direction. In terms of the overall state of travel demand forecasting, kind of the broader question you raised, Kevin, there's no question that the state of the art in the US is much less highly developed for long distance travel demand forecasting of the type that Connect uses than it is for short distance, kind of metropolitan focused travel demand forecasting. The majority of the work and the majority of the money that goes into travel demand forecasting in this country runs through metropolitan planning organizations. There are all sorts of statutory reasons that happens right now. So there's just a lot better data. There's a lot more work that goes into it. And in terms of kind of a nationwide model of this type, there really isn't much around similar to Connect that has the ability to essentially look at any CBSA pair in the country and look at mode shift with introduction of changes to passenger rail service, or for any mode for that matter. I will say that there are developments ongoing right now that hopefully will help this. There's been a much greater focus on long distance travel demand forecasting in the country overall. FHWA has been spearheading a lot of that effort with a couple of fits and starts here. They have looked at trying to develop nationwide activity-based models. They've looked at their travel analysis framework as being something that might be able to be used. But the exciting thing that's going on right now, actually, which could have a direct effect on this kind of work, is they are in the process of procuring location-based data from 3 of the largest vendors who provide that kind of data for the entire country at a CBSA level. So, at the same level of geographic detail that we look at in Connect. And we at FRA, I've been working with our colleagues at FHWA on that effort, and see a real opportunity to incorporate that into a future version of Connect, and hopefully see even more reliable and confidence building forecasts coming out of that, where we have real data developed on a consistent basis on a nationwide level, which is something that we did not have when we developed Connect initially or have made subsequent improvements.
Hey, Peter, it's Laura Cleaver.
Laura?
I have a question, 2 questions, and you might have said this already, but can you clarify again what you mean by longer distance? Is it over 700 miles, or are you talking about something between?
I'm more at so 700, I believe it's 700 miles is kind of the cutoff for Connect, and it's not over that. It's CBSA pairs that are more on that end of the range as opposed to those on the low end of the range, closer to the 50-mile low end cutoff.
Okay, and my second question is, and you might be getting to this now, but based on seeing this, did you look at other pairs that you might not have before? Seeing that, I mean, this network, and it, you know, based on the Midwest Regional Rail Initiative, still stresses heavily Chicago as the, you know, center. Did you look at other pairings that you hadn't looked at before in this second phase?
We did not, and you know, we really, and we'll look at this in a second, that we limited the kind of pivots or potential revisions that we looked at thus far, at least, to essentially subsets of the network that we had arrived at as part of under phase one. We did look, as we'll see, at some changing service tiers for various things. We didn't necessarily keep those constant, but in terms of the basic configuration of the corridors, we were looking at a subset of what we arrived at. And the reason for that was kind of twofold. One was, honestly, we needed to try to put some bounds around the scope of the analysis that we're looking at here. But even more than that, we did look at a lot of different options, different corridors, different network configurations under phase one. And by and large, we did not think that the changes in the auto trip table that that we were seeing, you know, the way it was affecting, say, longer trips versus shorter trips, or the kind of systematic reduction in auto trip volumes across the board that we were seeing, was likely to change those conclusions that we reached earlier in terms of what might be network independent, what might be integral parts of the network, what routing specific corridors might take in terms of the key CBSA that they would traverse. So, you know, the short answer is we haven't expanded things. We've really been looking at pivots off of what we arrived at phase one. I think we have one more, is that right?
Yeah, we have one more question. Will we be addressing routes to North Dakota today?
We will not be addressing those today. We did look at those as part of phase one. It's kind of a similar basic concept as what Laura just asked. And you know, what we found is that while there may be a lot of promise for routes into North Dakota, into other states, and corridors within states that are included in kind of the core network that we arrived at as part of phase one, it does not look like either the performance of the network as a whole would be changed significantly based on whether or not those other corridors, what we've labeled as kind of network independent corridors, are developed or not. And similarly, it did not seem like the success of those corridors would necessarily be very dependent on the overall development of the regional network. That, you know, if they were to be pursued, they would their success would be relatively self-contained to their own geography rather than tied integrally to the network overall.
Great, thanks, Peter. I think that's all the questions we received so far.
Peter, I'm sorry, but I have a follow-up based on that. I mean, I do think, you know, we've talked a lot about corridors such as Minneapolis to Fargo. I mean, I should say we've brought up, and different states have as well as the Wichita connection. It does seem like, in looking at this, that it's very Eastern oriented. And I'm just wondering how much information you included from south, the southern, flow up from the south or flow over from the west to come to this conclusion that these states that, of course, are on the far western part of our region would not be in some way integral to west-east or south-north flow of needed connections. And of course, just the north-south within our region. How much did you look at that? Is that something that we're going to need to do in the future because you didn't? That kind of thing is what I guess I'm asking.
Yeah, I think there are a few things on that that are definitely worth mentioning. I think first and foremost that in the final report that results from this effort, we in no way intend for for a corridor that's not included in the core regional network to in any way be considered something that shouldn't be pursued. This is not an exercise in really picking winners and losers and potential corridors within the region, but rather identifying those that would have the greatest degree of interaction, the greatest amount of synergy, and look at approaches for phasing the future development of a regional network in a way that recognizes and kind of builds on those interactions and those synergies. And in keeping with that, the maps that we will be presenting will include essentially everything that's been on the table proposed in the region, including connections to Fargo, including the north-south connection that goes through Wichita up to the Twin Cities. So all that will be baked in there. In terms of the analysis, I mean, we really did cast a pretty wide net with things. We looked at, as part of the baseline condition and market assessment, where the existing volumes seemed to be, and really focused in on those that had the highest volumes, the travel volumes associated with them in the existing modes, whether air or highway primarily. So, we did look at them, but, really the fact is that travel in the region is dominated, in terms of the volumes, is dominated by CDSA pairs that include Chicago and a couple of other major population centers in the region. And, that's where it seems like the greatest opportunities for kind of a synergistic development of a regional passenger rail network would lie. Now, there's some other options, and we were very keen to look at connections within the region that weren't just kind of hub and spoke oriented, with Chicago at the center, and those are things that we have continued to look at. But and I think the last thing to say is that some of these potential connections that are at the kind of outer limits of the geographic area we were looking at might have a lot more promise when looked at within the context of connections within or between regions, between large regions throughout the country, rather than connections within the region. One of the areas where that was most clear were potential connections between the Midwest and the Southeast being the subject of a parallel regional rail study that we've been working on. So, for example, connections southward towards Louisville, towards Nashville, when you start looking at the potential to then connect from there to Atlanta, which was beyond the scope of the Midwest study, corridors like that start to look a lot more promising and look like they have that ability to play kind of a synergistic role in the functioning of both regions, in that case, both the Midwest and the Southeast. And as we said, one of the things that FRA has been looking at is the possibility of doing studies similar to this that look at interregional connections as kind of a follow-on to studies like this one, which are really focused on connections within a relatively discrete region. So with that, I think we're gonna, in the interest of time, we're gonna move on, but have another chance, obviously, for Q&A and discussion at the end. So well, now, as I said, we went into this phase 2 effort looking at the possibility of refinements to the phase 1 network that might be advisable given the changes to the auto trip table that we saw. But it does clearly make sense that some refinements may be in order and that we ought to be looking at it. And then the question becomes, if we turn to the next slide here, what is the basis on which we make those refinements? What kind of optimization strategies or what performance objectives do we have for this network? In phase 1, it seemed like we got a bit of a Goldilocks outcome where we were able to achieve a bunch of things kind of simultaneously. And what the changes in network performance that we saw looking at things in light of the new auto trip table, it became clear that that kind of Goldilocks scenario may not be as feasible as we had previously hoped. So we have a bunch of different things that we can look at to try to optimize the network, to try to set as performance objectives for the network. And this is just a list that we came up with internally, and I think we are interested and really need to hear from you all if there are other objectives that you think we should be putting on the table. But here are a few. One is minimizing the upfront capital cost. Another that we looked at is trying to see what the best operating performance we could get matching the capital cost that we arrived at under phase 1 of $131 billion. We looked at how could we optimize things, while still matching the operating cost recovery ratio of phase 1 of 0.88. As we looked at before, in light of the new auto trip table, that 0.88 went down to 0.65, I believe. So, obviously, it would take a bit of tweaking to get things back up to a operating cost recovery ratio of that. We also looked at, what if we really tried to hit that kind of magic number of an operating cost recovery ratio of 1, where your revenues are really covering the entirety of your operating and maintenance costs and capital replacement. We looked at options that kind of match the current level of annual financial support for operations that states in the region provide. Obviously, the Midwest has certainly the broadest and one of the most extensive networks of state-supported passenger rail service in the country. And the states spend a lot of money on that right now, and wanted to look at what's the most we could get if we just tried to match that. We also looked at, and think it makes sense to look at options for maximizing the geographic coverage of the network to make sure that it creates some equity within the region overall, rather than just focuses on a few corridors that may have the greatest potential for positive financial performance, but may serve a very small portion of the region overall. We also looked at options where we kind of looked at operating and maintenance costs and capital costs together, or rather operating and maintenance support, kind of surplus or loss in capital costs together over the life of the network going out to that 2055 horizon year. And the way that we measured that was, or you can look to kind of set an objective for that, is to maximize the financial net present value of the network, with the net present value really only taking into account revenue, operating and maintenance costs, and capital costs. It's not a net present value in the broader kind of economic cost benefit analysis sense, when you're taking in a bunch of other quantified and monetized benefits that may not be captured in any financial sense. This is really purely from a financial perspective. And in doing that, it's a way of essentially looking at the trade-offs between spending more on capital up front versus spending less on O&M costs going forward, or vice versa. And lastly, you know, and this is always something that folks are interested in, setting as an objective simply maximizing ridership and or passenger miles, you know, maximizing the amount of transportation generated by this network or handled by this network, either through mode shift or to a much lesser extent through any kind of induced demand. So turning to the next slide here, we looked at metrics we could use essentially as yardsticks to measure the success of reaching those various optimization goals, those performance goals that we looked at in the last slide. So we had, on one hand, kind of primary network metrics that are spat out directly from Connect, ridership, passenger miles, revenue, kind of the big three things on the demand side: annual operating and maintenance costs, upfront capital costs, and route miles as a measure of geographic coverage. We then looked at what we termed efficiency metrics, which kind of look at various ways of thinking about primary network metrics. So operating cost recovery ratio is nothing more than, you know, revenues to, oh, I'm getting a message that I may have frozen. All right. Are things good now? Someone can, okay, I'm going to take it from efficiency metrics. Sorry about that. Thanks for your patience with that. So on the efficiency metrics, they essentially are different ways of measuring bang for your buck, consisting of combinations of the primary metrics. So operating cost recovery ratio is nothing more than revenues divided by O&M costs. You can look at simply the O&M surplus loss in absolute terms, revenues minus O&M costs. You can look at that same thing divided by passenger mile to kind of get a sense of how much surplus per unit of transportation or how much operating financial support per unit of transportation the network is either generating or require. As I mentioned, we looked at financial net present value, essentially looking at the overall capital costs, operating and maintenance costs, and revenue streams for the network out to 2055, discounting all of those cash flows and seeing what the net present value is of the overall financial performance of the network. And then lastly, we looked at net present value per passenger miles. It's a little bit of a corollary to the O&M surplus loss per passenger mile, but it is capturing both operating and capital costs. There definitely is obviously a inclination to treat capital costs and capital investment as being different and in ways almost discounting the actual costs there when compared to operating costs. There's often an emphasis on trying to absolutely keep operating and maintenance costs to a minimum, even if it means spending far more on capital. But we thought it would be helpful to look at these last two efficiency metrics as a way of combining both the O&M and the capital side and capturing the full financial performance of the network, particularly given that we may end up with situations where if you look at all the money that would go into the network as fungible, regardless of whether or not it's going to operations or going to capital investment, we may see, we thought we might see network options with similar NPVs or similar net present value per passenger mile that might perform vastly differently in terms of the total volume of transportation, that they generate in terms of ridership and passenger miles, or in terms of the geographic coverage of the networks. So with that, we're going to actually turn to a little bit of an interactive exercise here. A polling question where we're asking you what the 3 most important network performance priorities should be, looking at the list that we looked at a couple of slides ago. This really is likely to be a huge part of it. We think it's going to be a huge part of the discussion amongst all of us going forward. You know, where do we place our priorities? And we certainly anticipate, and we know that it has for ourselves, that what is important may shift a little bit based on what we actually see in the results and, you know, approaches and strategies towards addressing or going after some of these priorities. So we opened up the poll now on Zoom. We give it a little bit of time for you to put in your answers, but you should have had that pop up now. And again, just click on what your top 3 options would be. You can pick 3. If you have less than 3, you can do less than 3, but cap it at 3 there. And it looks like we have, just bear with me. So we had a question come in from Rick Harnish asking about what the purpose of the study is. And that's a great point that we should have addressed early on. And, you know, in a nutshell, it is to determine on the basis of you know, concrete transportation planning and analysis, a long-term roadmap for the development of intercity passenger rail service within the Midwest, within the 12-state region that we have outlined. So again, it is very long-term. It's looking at where we think things ought to get to by 2055, and then figuring out as well how one might determine how you get from where we are right now to where we think things would be good to get to by 2055. And it really is, you know, being driven by the analysis more than anything else. But a huge element of this is the feedback that we get from you all, the stakeholders, on what the priorities should be. And, you know, this poll is a huge part of that. You know, it kind of encapsulates that, where there may be a bunch of different ways one could go. Some may be equal to others in certain ways, but different in others. It really just depends on where you place the priority. So again, you know, the purpose of the overall study is creating that long-term vision for intercity passenger rail development in the region overall, recognizing that you can't get to the best outcome by simply looking at individual corridors in isolation. You really should be looking at it as a network overall. So I think we'll close. We've had about 3 minutes now for voting, so perhaps we can end the polling and we can take a look at the results thus far.
Great. I will share the results right here. Can you see it on your screen?
I am seeing it, but I am a co-host. So if someone wants, who's a participant, wants to type something into the chat,
we can see it. Peter, we can see it.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So
as long as I'm off mute for a second, can I ask, is there an opportunity to add additional criteria here? I mean, you've thrown up some good ones. There are other ones out there as well.
Yeah, this was just our first cut, and we do want to hear other criteria, other objectives that folks think are important. So again, looking at just this first cut of options, but and also obviously before we've seen any of the results of the analysis we've done thus far, you know, people seem to be very interested in maximizing ridership and passenger miles as an objective. And also, interestingly, looking at, minimizing combined capital and O&M costs. So, maximizing the net present value of the network, and not necessarily simply looking at operating as being the major concern from a financial perspective. And also, as we thought might be the case, maximizing geographic coverage, making sure that we achieve a level of geographic equity in the recommendations. It's come out pretty strong there. So that is really good input, and something that we will be revisiting going forward. So with that, I think we can close the poll, bring up the presentation if folks, I think it's still there, but I'm going to hand it over now to Alexis Howland, who again is the technical lead with the consulting team on the study. And she's going to first talk about some of the additional enhancements, tweaks to the model that, that we incorporated into phase 2, and that will be reflected in the results that we look at going forward. Changes in addition to simply the changes to the auto trip table. And she'll also walk us through the real main event, the meat of this session, which are the various options for the networks that we've looked at so far, again, with different options, looking at addressing different performance objectives of the type that we just looked at just now. Hand it over to Alexis.
Hey, hi everyone. I just also want to be sure that the presentation, everyone can see it right now. I'm not sure if with the poll, when that was shown, if it disrupted the slides.
I can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you. So as we are moving forward with this analysis of network alternatives, we made some adjustments globally in phase 2 that ensured consistency as we were testing out these different networks. One of them was that we excluded the Detroit to Toronto corridor. And this was just because the changes, the updates that were made to the underlying trip tables were inconsistent on the Detroit to Toronto corridor, essentially in Canada, as opposed to the changes that were made for the US markets. So just for consistency and for clarity, we removed that from the Connect model testing. If you'll recall, in phase 1, we also did a fare sensitivity analysis where after we had developed the draft network, then we went through and analyzed how adjusting the fares impacted ridership. And then we settled on an 80% fare sensitivity. So we adjusted the fares somewhat lower than what their default settings were. But so to be consistent with the phase 1 process, we just set the fares back at 100% with the idea that, again, once we have sort of a draft network, then we'll do that sensitivity analysis where we might see the ridership move somewhat on the margins after we have the core network set. We also, as Peter mentioned, there are updated O&M unit costs, which we integrated into the phase 2 adjustments. And with the new Connect model, we are now able to test more than 15 corridors. So in phase 1, for example, there were some corridors that we, such as Omaha to Chicago to Carbondale, that we modeled as one corridor, although structurally, maybe it would make more sense to identify those as 2 separate corridors. And that's what we did in phase 2, is so some of those combined corridors we separated out in the phase 2 testing. So this was the previous draft network with the phase 2 adjustments. So this incorporates all the adjustments I just covered, plus it has the updated underlying trip tables. So in the table on the left, you'll see how this draft, our phase 1 draft network, now performs in phase 2. And these metrics will be
our point of comparison as we move forward and look at the other alternatives.
And Alexa, just one thing to note for everyone's benefits. So the baseline, again, as Alexa said, is the performance of the network that we arrived at as phase one. But what you'll see is that the actual figures there are different in some cases than the performance metrics we looked at earlier on in the study, where we were comparing the performance of that phase one network, where the only change we made was to the auto trip table. So as Alexis said, this includes chopping up corridors that we had strung together before, revisions and enhancements to the O&M cost estimates. So it's not a like for like comparison with what we looked at before, but going forward, it'll ensure that we'll have consistency between estimates of performance of the phase one network and these other options that we've looked at as part of phase two so far.
So just some key highlights from the performance of the draft network in phase two. We have annual ridership in year 2055 of about 19 million passengers. We have 5.4 billion passenger miles, annual O&M costs of 2 billion, and annual revenue generated of 1.5 billion, and a capital cost of about 141 billion. So as we explored alternative networks, we used the phase one draft network structure sort of as our basis. So the trip table updates did not suggest that there were different corridors that would perform better that weren't identified in phase one. So we focused on refining essentially the corridors that were already identified. So we tested changes to their service tier, and we looked at whether it made sense or not for a corridor to necessarily be included in the Connect model. Numerous variations were tested, and then just a sampling of the most illustrative networks is included in this presentation. Also, we just want to add a clarifying point that corridors with existing service may not be reflected in the Connect model here, but that's not suggesting that they would not exist in the future, that they wouldn't be in service in the coming years. So with option A, the objective here was to minimize the capital cost. And we also, with this approach, maximized geographic coverage. So essentially, this is the phase one draft network, but we bumped down the service tiers across the board. So it's almost entirely at the emerging service tier, with the exception of Chicago to the Twin Cities, which is at Core Express. And while this has major capital cost savings, it only costs close to $59 billion. There are major reductions in ridership, in passenger miles, and in revenue. So the annual O&M costs drop. You'll see they go from 2 billion to 1.2 billion. But that decline is far less than the decline in revenue. Revenue declines from 1.5 billion to 0.5 billion. So the operating recovery ratio is relatively low at just 0.39. But this does maintain extensive geographic coverage. Now, option B also looks at minimizing capital cost, but in a much more focused investment way. So this network focuses all of the service essentially on the pillar corridors. And all of them are at relatively high service tiers. So Chicago to the Twin Cities is at Core Express, while the connections to St. Louis, Indianapolis, and Detroit are at the regional service tier. Again, this has a relatively low overall capital cost, close to 66 billion. But again, compared to the baseline, you see significant ridership declines. However, compared to option A, which had the more expansive geographic coverage, the revenue almost matches the annual O&M expense. So you're getting close to an operating recovery ratio of 1. Also, you will have access to this PowerPoint after the presentation. So you'll have time to sit with these tables if you want to look over the specific data in more detail. Option C focuses on maximizing the operating recovery ratio. So you'll see here the operating recovery ratio is 1.31. So we're generating about $5 billion or $500 million more in revenue each year than in the annual O&M costs. However, there is less geographic coverage than in the baseline conditions. The corridors that are included here are all at a relatively higher service tier. So this network focuses a lot on Core Express service within regional connections out to Columbus and to Pittsburgh. You'll also notice here that the Columbus corridor to Chicago goes via Fort Wayne, which is a point of comparison here with this next option D, which also maximizes operating recovery ratio, except in this version, Columbus connects to Indianapolis via Core Express corridor and then continues on to Chicago. So this also maximizes the operating recovery ratio. You'll see that it is at 1.41. And this, you'll start to see here too that in this network configuration, Indianapolis is functioning as a hub, essentially. So this is sort of hinting at the importance of the connections that Indianapolis can offer to other regional cities. Option E maximizes ridership, also with an emphasis on expanding geographic coverage. So in this network configuration, we have the regional service connection out to Kansas City, and we also have added the corridor from Cincinnati to Indianapolis at a regional service tier. Ridership here is 27% higher than in the baseline network. So we're over 24 million annual riders, and annual passenger miles is also 59% higher than the baseline at 8.6 billion. The capital cost is only 12% greater than the baseline network, and the operating recovery ratio is 1. So we're able here in this network to generate revenue that approximately covers the annual O&M costs. Option F also maximizes ridership, but it focuses the capital investment on fewer corridors, but at higher service tiers. So you'll see here that almost the entire network is at the Core Express service tier, with the exception of Chicago through Cleveland to Pittsburgh, which is at regional. The ridership is, again, 27% higher than the baseline ridership. And you'll see the ridership with this option closely matches the ridership of the prior option, option E. And the annual capital cost, or the initial capital cost, is also only slightly greater than the baseline capital cost. And again, in this network, you see Indianapolis functioning as a hub in the network. So there's service to Nashville, Cincinnati, and Columbus connects into Indianapolis. Option G matches or closely hews to the baseline capital cost, while also sort of striving to have a more expansive geographic coverage. So you'll see here that the capital cost for this network is almost the same as the capital cost of the baseline. It's at about $138 billion. You'll see that this network sort of emphasizes more the regional service tier, and particularly in the eastern portion of the region. However, it also has the connection out to Kansas City. The ridership and passenger miles are greater than the baseline network. So you do see sort of improved ridership and passenger mile performance here. This network also has an operating recovery ratio of 0.87, which, if you'll recall, that is pretty close to what the operating recovery ratio was from our phase 1 network. So with the phase 1 O&M unit costs and the phase 1 trip tables, our draft network from that phase had an operating recovery ratio of about 0.88. So this closely matches that as well. Option H also strives to match the baseline capital cost, but while pursuing a more focused capital investment. So compared to option G, let me just flip back quickly. So in option G, you'll see there's the connection between Fort Wayne to Columbus and the connection from Indianapolis to Dayton, as well as the 3C corridor. In option H, there are fewer network connections in the eastern portion of the network, but then the corridors that are on there tend to be at a higher service tier. So we don't have an emerging corridor. Everything is either at the regional or core express level. And again, this also closely matches the operating recovery ratio from phase 1, and you do see ridership and passenger mile gains over the baseline network. Now, this is a comparison table that sort of aggregates all of the data that was presented in the slides that we just went over, and I know that this can sort of look like an overwhelming amount of information, but again, you'll have time on your own to sort of take this in, sit with it for a little while and really digest what's presented here. But in this table, for each of the options, we see all of the metrics, and they are color coded by standard deviation. So you'll notice that the sort of yellow cells, those indicate values that are within 1 standard deviation from the mean for these 9 networks. And you'll see that it seems to be across the board that a lot of these are sort of performing within that 1 standard deviation. And then once you start to get into the red and green shades, those are indicating metrics that are beyond 1 standard deviation from the mean, with red indicating sort of a less desirable performance and green indicating better performance.
one thing, Alexis, just to note on that last slide there is that, I found myself doing this as well, is that as you start to kind of correlate some of these metrics, which are along the x-axis there, to potential objectives for the performance of the corridor, you can kind of start circling the columns that matter to you, essentially. So for instance, if you're really concerned about geographic coverage, looking at that route mile column and comparing things across the board there is a way to look. If you're really concerned about operating cost recovery ratio or the annual O&M surplus or loss, you can look at those two columns there. Similarly, if you want to look at kind of the combined operating and maintenance and capital financial demands over the life of the corridor going out to 2055, you can look at that NPV column. So there's a lot of information presented here, and it certainly at first blush was overwhelming to me, but kind of when you start focusing in, you can really kind of start wrapping your head around what, given your own perspective on things, which of these options look more appealing and which might look less so.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah, I hope that all of you are able, just take some time and just digest this over the next week, and then hopefully it'll be a little more helpful for you. Additionally, we have another table here that presents a different way of considering how these options compare to each other. So in this table, we don't show the metric values, but we rank the options by their metric performance, sort of with 1 being a better outcome and 9 being a less desirable outcome. So for example, if we look at the ridership column, which is the second column here in this table, we see that option F has the highest ridership, so it is ranked in the first position. And the baseline network has sort of the middle level ridership, so that is ranked in the 5th position. And then option B has the lowest ridership, so it is in the 9th position. And again, this table, if it hasn't already, will be emailed to you, and you'll have time to sort of consider this on your own. All right, now I'm going to hand the presentation off to Anna Lynn.
Actually, if we can just go back up one slide, I was a little slow jumping on there, but I mentioned that the slide before this looked a little overwhelming at first blush, but again, this one, if you kind of stare at it a while, it starts to kind of become clear. And just to give an example, if you focus on kind of the colors on the chart and see which colors seem to kind of congregate towards the top of it versus those that don't, you can get a sense of which of these options seem to have better performance kind of across the board, across a whole bunch of different factors. And similarly, you can kind of circle the columns that are most important to you to kind of get a sense of that. This is one definitely that is best suited to take a look at as some of your homework between now and next week. But I think as you kind of stare at it for a while, as I did, the value of it becomes apparent, and you kind of get a little bit, you get some insights that you don't necessarily get simply by looking at the values that were on the previous chart there. And yeah, sorry, and again, handing it over to Anna Lynn for some Q&A.
Not at all. Thanks for that further explanation. I know that one is a little harder to digest. So we've had a couple questions come in, and we want to continue the discussion. We got about another 25 minutes or so here. Kyle, I know you've been tracking these. If can read them off?
Yep, I can start rolling through them. So our first question is, I am curious as to how you might approach your forecast due to the lingering influence of COVID on travel.
Right.
That is an excellent question, and honestly, one that I don't think we're in a very good position to address within kind of a long range study like this. I mean, there's clearly a huge amount of uncertainty in the near and in the midterm on, travel behavior, both short distance and long distance. I know I, for one, am imagining that, there may be some lingering effects of folks having both desire to limit their long distance travel and potentially, if they are to travel, to use modes that limit their exposure to other people or maximize their ability to distance themselves from other people. And clearly that's going to have an effect on our industry, in the near to midterm. And the longer term, which is the focus of this, I think it's much more difficult to say. Just reading an article last night in the paper about kind of how quickly the influenza pandemic, I was at the tail end of World War I, receded from people's memory. It's unclear exactly what those long-term ramifications would be. So it isn't something that I think is kind of within our scope to take into consideration as part of this study, but certainly we have already heard from states that are looking at corridor specific studies and how they might approach nearer term development of existing or new passenger rail corridors, that there's a lot of well-grounded hesitancy to go too far out on a limb given what we're looking at right now in the near to midterm.
Great, thanks, Peter. So the next question we have is, can you please talk more about excluding the Detroit to Toronto connection? I don't understand that exclusion.
Yeah, I mean, the basic issue is not necessarily that it is something that would be excluded from the network, but rather was excluded from this analysis, really on the basis of the fact that in the revisions that we did to the auto trip table, it was not possible to address the CVSA pairs that cross the international borders, that given the time constraints and other constraints we were under, and the fact that those cross-border CVSA pairs relied on different sets of data and slightly different methodology and sets of assumption than CVSA pairs within the United States, we just weren't able to address those. And we found actually that when we compared some of those cross-border CVSA pairs to CVSA pairs with similar geographic and demographic characteristics within the United States, that the old estimates of auto travel for those cross-border CVSA pairs did not look quite right. So we just kind of peeled it out from this analysis, but that by no means is intended to say that that is no longer, that will not end up as part of the network that's in the final report. I mean, we're going to have to make a judgment on that, but certainly the earlier analysis that we did showed that that cross-border corridor had some promise, but we're just going to kind of need to see how that looks within the context of the other revisions that we look at as part of phase 2.
Great. So the next question is, are there no regional core express corridors in the new analysis?
And Peter, I believe this has to do with the way for phase 1, we had kind of that teal color that was regional and or core express, where we did not specify. It could go either way, basically, in terms of the final direction that particular corridor was to head. Is that correct, Peter? And then here we made that determination.
I think that's right. And I think that the difference is that we may still end up with some lines on the map with that teal color. I mean, again, and this gets to the earlier question that Rick asked about what the purpose of the overall study is. And, again, it's focused on the region as a whole, focused on potential synergies and the performance of multiple corridors when they're all looked at, as a whole. And it's not intended to, rule out or somehow take off the table the development of potentially smaller, what we deem network independent corridors. But similarly, it's also not supposed to just zero in on one particular service level for the corridors that we do identify. For a few coming out of phase one, we found that some of those look like they could work as Core Express, they could work at regional. It probably makes sense to look at options that span that's part of the spectrum as part of follow-on corridor-specific studies. That would come after we're done with this long-range regional study. And I imagine that will happen. It's very possible that'll happen here too, that we may end up with corridors that look like they have promise either as regional or Core Express, potentially some that may look like they have promise as integral parts of the network, either as emerging or regional. So yeah, that's really kind of what the difference is there.
Great. And Rick, just to let you know, we'll open the floor after we're done reading these questions that we received in the chat. I will unmute your line. So the next question is, so am I reading the slides correctly, that nearly all of the options were comparing drop service to much of Iowa and Southern Illinois?
That is a great question. I think that came from Jim Matthews. And I had the same kind of reaction looking through these. And I think what's important to note, again, kind of going back to what the objectives of the overall study is, it's not to say that corridors that don't end up as bold lines on the map are things that aren't worth pursuing, but rather that their success is not dependent on the network as a whole. And similarly, the success of the network as a whole might not be closely dependent on those corridors, on the performance of those corridors. What we essentially seem to be seeing as a result of the revised forecast for auto travel that we're using in phase two is that those corridors, particularly going down to Carbondale and going out to Omaha, seem not to have a level of performance where they kind of rise to the level of being integral to the network. That again, they may be completely worth pursuing the development of. In the case of going down to Carbondale, there's already a robust service there that plays a very important role, certainly in the state of the Illinois, and an important role regionally as well. Likewise, going out to Omaha, both Illinois and Iowa have been pursuing developing service through that corridor, and those would still show up on the map. It's more that the analysis and the new estimates of forecasted auto trips just don't seem to make those as integral part of the performance of the corridor or of a network within the region overall as the old trip table does. And part of the reason behind that is, I think, by and large, it's not so much that those were shorter corridors, but certainly that a lot of the travel within those corridors was concentrated on CBSA pairs that were relatively closer together. And it was those shorter distance CBSA pairs that seemed to show the greatest reduction in forecasts of 2055 auto travel volumes with the new trip table.
Great. So we have another question. What type of cost does the capital cost include?
What types of costs does it include?
Correct, yes.
So it's fairly all-encompassing. So it looks at, particularly for Core Express and really kind of across the board, the possibility for right-of-way acquisition, the construction of the fixed assets, stations, tracks, signal, electrification in the case of Core Express. It looks at the cost of rolling stock, of maintenance of equipment facilities, of stations. And there are, though, this is an important point to make, there are a lot of kind of generalizations and simplifications that are included there. And there also is not necessarily a full recognition that where there is existing service on some of these corridors, assets that are out there today will be able to be used even as those corridors are further developed. Either, you know, they may have something akin to emerging service now, and maybe that emerging service would be expanded to be a more robust emerging service, or maybe expanded up to regional service. And you wouldn't necessarily be building new stations or, you know, all new track and whatnot. I think that the fact is, though, that when we look at the capital costs overall, if you were kind of to net out the ability to make continued use of assets that are out there today supporting existing passenger rail service in the region, the amount that would be netted out relative to the overall capital cost that we're estimating for the network would be relatively small. And at the same time, the ability to net out the cost of existing assets that would continue to be used would be a very complicated undertaking and not necessarily move the needle that much. So again, hope that captures for you kind of both the scope of the capital costs that are included and kind of the limitations and kind of simplifications and some of the methodological assumptions that go into preparing those estimates.
Great. So Kevin had a note suggesting another criterion for evaluating the projects, ratio of total benefits to the total costs using methodology prior to FRA work.
Yeah, and you know, I'll say in you know, addressing Kevin's very good suggestion there, that for everyone, one of the things that we'd like to hear from you, and we'll get into this when we discuss the next steps, is any other suggestions for possible performance objectives for the network overall. So, you know, we had the poll, you know, we had the slide kind of going through the options there, but that's not a comprehensive list. You know, we came up with that based on brainstorming internally, and there are other things that are out there that may be very worthwhile to pursue. So please let us know, you know, as soon as possible, really, if you've got other ideas, so we can see what we can do to investigate those between now and when we reconvene next week. One of the complications when it comes to Kevin's specific suggestion on, you know, ratio of total benefits to total cost is that we ran into some complications as well in the benefit cost analysis module that we relatively recently developed for the Connect tool. The idea was actually to be able to do and kind of spit out in an automated way results that would support assessing network options in very much the way that Kevin suggests. And what we found, though, is that there were some inconsistencies in the methodology that was developed, specifically where we were not capturing benefits to users that resulted from the fact that we may be introducing, by expanding or developing passenger rail service, a transportation option that would get people to shift from, say, auto or air to rail, but which may not actually generate travel time savings, that people may divert from one mode to another because rail is simply cheaper from a out-of-pocket cost perspective. And there actually is an economic benefit associated with folks spending less out of pocket on transportation than they would using other you know, other transportation options. We are pursuing the refinements to do that. You know, for those who groove on this stuff, we're looking at doing a direct estimate of change in consumer surplus, and then a corresponding estimate of the change in producer surplus, so that we have that kind of like for like comparison. But we honestly, we aren't there yet right now. So, you know, that specific suggestion by Kevin, we're right there with you. We think it's something we should be able to look at, but we just aren't there in terms of the basic analytical tools right now, you know, given, you know, everything that's in front of us.
Great, thank you, Peter. I'm gonna unmute Rick here and let him have the floor to ask whatever question you have.
Hello, thank you. This is Rick Harnish with the High Speed Alliance. I want to emphasize that this is a very, very important study, and that I'm excited that it's moving forward. I am really happy that you've presented multiple options at the end. I think after some more review, there's a significant point to be made in there. But I continue to have serious concerns about the underlying assumptions in the study. One is taking a purely regional context. You miss the stuff that's happening outside of the region, and perhaps that would change it. For example, if you looked at Chicago to Atlanta as part of it, or Chicago to New York. So we really have to understand how this fits into a national context. I think there needs to be more clarification on what the purpose of this study is. But my biggest concern is the definition of regional. As I recall from the initial discussions, regional service between Chicago and St. Louis was 16 trains a day at 3 hours. And we have demonstrated in this state, in the real world, that that is not achievable without building a new high-speed line. You cannot add grade crossing free tracks to the existing rights of way. So you have to build a new high-speed line to get to the regional service levels. And that means that if you're assuming a whole bunch of regional service, it's not an achievable network. And I think that needs to be seriously considered as you consider these options that you put forward.
Oh, those are very good points, Rick. And, on your first one, in terms of limiting the scope of this to the regional context, whereas if you expand it and look at neighboring regions, it might lead us to different conclusions. It's an extremely valid point. I will say that in the case of at least one of the examples that you mentioned with Chicago to Atlanta, we have an opportunity to look at that, and had an opportunity to look at that because we have had regional studies going on in parallel that cover the regions in which both Chicago and Atlanta lie, both the Midwest Regional Rail Plan Study and the Southeast Regional Rail Plan Study. And that Atlanta connection is something that looks like it has some promise, and that may end up actually making it into the final report for both studies in one form or another. And I think one of the things that we'll be looking to emphasize in the final report for this is that a regional rail plan study like this can't be considered the end-all, be-all basis for the development of intercity passenger rail service in this country. That there is a gap in those interregional connections, Rick, that you mentioned, and we're taking this in a somewhat stepwise fashion. We're looking at these regional studies as a first step to developing kind of a national plan for intercity passenger rail development, but that it is very clear that follow-on studies looking at those interregional connections are going to be a very important part of an overall strategic approach to developing passenger rail service, and that the results of looking at those interregional connections could end up changing some of the conclusions that we reached when we looked at things only in that regional context. And another thing to mention too is that, and this is kind of a basic foundation for this overall study in these regional rail plans generally, is that they are not intended to be the basis for making investment decisions on actually implementing corridors, that they are a way of identifying how corridors within a region may fit together, what key CBSA markets corridors should serve, essentially kind of as a very baseline measure. Look at, they look at options for determining the sequencing of implementing corridors. But in all cases, before anything moves to construction, we would anticipate there would need to be corridor-specific studies looking at each of these corridors in more detail, identifying the actual capital investments needed, supporting the eventual environmental review of the development of the corridors, and likewise looking at possibilities for expanding corridors beyond the regional scope that we're looking at here. And the possibility that in looking at things within that broader context, perhaps including the interregional context, you may take a different direction in the development of some of these corridors than you would if you were only looking at it within that regional context.
But I want to emphasize that this study will inform the political discussion. It will inform the planning directions of the states. And to have a type of service in here that we have demonstrated is not achievable as the core of this study in the regional network, or the regional service level in a regional network, it really impacts the way the political discussion is going to happen. And so you really need to consider whether these 3 tiers are the correct tiers or not. And I would argue strongly they are not the correct tiers and not the correct way to talk about service levels in a network. So that was a statement, not a question.
Got it. And I know that these are things that, I know we're up against time here. We have about 5 minutes left. Thank you, Rick. These are questions. I know there's a couple other questions and comments that have come in. We will provide answers to those. We'll kick off our session next week with answers to those questions, as well as just give you a preview. I'll transition over to Peter, but this next session is meant to be more of an interactive event where we have breakout groups and we will be having the smaller group discussions, but we will definitely provide, and we want you to think of any more questions that you have, and we'll document the questions from today and continue the discussion in that manner. So I'll transition over to Peter here for a closeout.
Thanks, Annalyn, and thanks to Alexis as well for walking us through the bevy of information on the various options that we've looked at thus far. It was a lot to get through in a condensed period of time, but as Alexis mentioned, I believe already we have emailed out to you both the presentation and some reference sheets that allow you to essentially look at the various network options that we reviewed today and those 2 tables that we looked at the end, kind of all at one time to compare them more clearly. So again, if you have additional questions, please send them to Alexis by the end of the day on Thursday, September 17th. Her email address is there. That'll give us a chance to make sure that we're able to incorporate as much as we can into kicking off the much more discussion-oriented session that we have scheduled for next Tuesday. In terms of your own homework, in addition to us having you listen through 2 hours of us briefing you on things, we've got homework as well to review those networks using those reference sheets that we've sent out. As be prepared to discuss with the whole group your own perspective on things, what you see as your own priorities for the development of the network. Any questions or concerns you have about basic methodological issues, similar to the type that Rick raised about, potential feasibility of a regional service tier as an approach to developing corridors within the network. We'll also be sending out a quick survey for you after we finish up here. And again, we ask if you can complete that by the end of the day on Thursday. That'll give us a chance to compile everything and get the input from that reflected in the materials for next Tuesday. And that brings us to our next session. Next Tuesday, September 22nd, another 2-hour session, 9 to 11 Central Daylight Time. I think that should be, but and again, that will be a much more interactive kind of conversation-centered session. We'll be having breakout rooms so that we can discuss the goals and the metrics and the various options that we've explored thus far in smaller groups that are a bit more manageable, and using that feedback as the basis for what will be our homework coming out of these 2 sessions, which is to further refine things, perhaps look at a few other options and be prepared to reconvene the group in the next month or so to look at some kind of one or more final options for what would be reflected in a final report. So we look forward to seeing you next week. If we want to come to the next last slide here. Just have the contact information for all of us. If you got any questions or concerns, again, don't hesitate to reach out. And I don't want to underemphasize that we really are looking for feedback from you to help guide our path forward from where we are right now. So if you are able to spend some time with the materials that we've sent you and come prepared to give us your input, whether praise or otherwise, when we reconvene next Tuesday, that'll just make sure that we get as good a conclusion from this study and as solid a final report as we can coming out of the last few years of work here. So with that, we're right at noon Eastern, 11 o'clock Central on the dot. We'll close things out. And again, if you had any questions we weren't able to get to, make sure you get them to us. You can send them to Alexis, and we will definitely lead off next Tuesday with answers to those. So I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their week, the rest of their day, and look forward to talking again next Tuesday. Thank you.